Shelby Steele is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He has been awarded the prestigious Bradley Prize and the National Humanities Medal. He is also an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker and author and a contributing editor to Harper's Magazine. He received the National Book Critics Circle Award for his work, The Content of Our Character, a New Vision of Race in America. Shelby, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It pains me to see a country like Israel accused of all sorts of banalities, we'll say euphemistically, but particularly racism. I do not believe that Israel is a racist nation, period. What interests me, what I want to talk a little bit about today is where a charge like that comes from, what it really represents, what's going on in particularly the conflict with the Palestinians and so forth. What brings forth this charge? To do that, I want to talk briefly about a short story by the great French writer Albert Camus. Wrote a short story called The Guest that touches on some of these issues remarkably well. I don't know if he knew how accurate, how prescient this story was, but it's a story I've thought over many times. The main character of the story is what we would call today a white liberal. His name is Daru, and he is a teacher in Algeria. He teaches Arab students out in the desert, on the plateau country of Algeria, all alone, all by himself. One day he looks up, and at his door, I'll sort of cut to the chase as much as I can. He wakes up one morning, opens the door, looks out, and there is two men, one on horseback, one walking. The man on horseback is a gendarme, a French policeman, who is transporting a criminal to prison in Algeria, in Algiers, the city of Algiers. And there is the Algerian Revolution is sort of simmering in the background of this story. So Daru receives this guest, as he's called, and the policeman asks him, or essentially tells him, that he will have to watch this man overnight, and that in the morning, authorities will come and pick him up and take him to prison. Daru is a liberal and is offended by this, and doesn't really know or care much what the crime involved was. He doesn't like the idea of participating in colonialism, in oppression. And so he treats the prisoner who's in his charge very warmly, humanely, overnight. And they even have conversations through the middle of the night. When they wake up the next morning, lo and behold, no one comes to pick up the guest. Daru thinks to himself for very briefly, gathers up the guest, takes him on a long hike across the plateau to the very rim of it, stops there, and at that moment, he puts a package of food in the guest's arms, in the Arab's arms. And along with the food, he gives him at least 1,000 francs, which is a considerable amount of money. And then he tells him there are two roads. One leads to the prison where they are expecting him, and the other leads back to his people who have lost him. And he then says, "You are now free, utterly free." And it is an extraordinarily resonant freedom that the man experiences. To make the story a little shorter, right away, as he receives these packages of food and this money, he begins to, his color begins to drain. He's obviously very intimidated. And Daru turns around and looks at him and sees in his face, Daru turns his back on him. He begs Daru not to leave him there. He begs Daru not to make him free. He wants a return to not being free, being a colonial victim and so forth. He escapes his freedom. Well, Daru walks away from him and leaves him there, even now, more alone than ever. He walks a mile or so, Daru does, stops, he turns around and he looks back behind him and he sees the Arab walking very slowly on the road to prison. Prison is preferable to freedom. Well, this is a circumstance of oppressed people. When freedom finally comes, it is a humiliation. It is a reminder of their inferiority, of their lack of ability to master their own fate. And they suffer powerfully. And the first reaction, of course, almost always is to say, oh no, we're not really free. He's lying. Freedom is an illusion. Well, this young man was very much like that, he probably had a little more integrity than most, and so he gives himself up to prison and hides away from freedom. Well, what have the Palestinians done for woe these many decades since World War II? What has been their response to freedom? Usually in the third world, Black America is a prime example. There's an embrace of the idea that one is in fact not free, one is a victim. Victimhood spares you the agony and the self-denigration that freedom exposes you to. In Black America, for example, the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which granted our freedom legally under the law and so forth and so on, within a snap of a finger, the Black Power movement was born. And all of a sudden, having now attained freedom, we turned right around and said we were not free, denied it, and said that racism was everywhere. And racism is stronger than it's ever been, even as racism was dropping away, melting away. Well, it's a pretty privileged situation to find harbor in victimization. Well, but if you are a victim, then of course you need a victimizer. You need somebody to limit your fate, to be racist, to be bigoted. Well, sadly, Israel dwells in a neighborhood where there are many peoples like that across the Arab world, so that Israel becomes the perfect sort of victimizer, no matter what it does in reality. It's not, the reality is not the point. The point is relief from the angst of inferiority, of being unable to compete, of looking at the world now, which is smaller and smaller, and seeing how far off from the mark one is, how hopeless one's fate is. And so there is, of course, across the third world, movement after movement that tries to make victimization an identity. Victimhood as a victim is who I am. It's not something I'm interested in or whatever. It is my fate. And the world has to treat me as such. And as such, I am entitled. I'm entitled to all sorts of things, not just civil rights bills, but social programs of every kind. And because I deserve that, I deserve the only relationship the larger society should have to me is to give me things. It is the Jews that are my problem, that cause all sorts of difficulty for me. Not me, not my own deficits, not my own weaknesses. And so hatred becomes a bomb. Now no matter what kind of, in the Black America, the moment we became free, we fell into decline. And we've been declining relentlessly through trillions of dollars of social programs since the 60s. Today in the inner cities is a nihilistic terrain of utter human collapse because no one knows, no one believes in the freedom that we have. We have the freedom to do anything, including be the president. You can make any kind of a life for yourself these days. Well, so the result is you hide behind victimization and you claim that you need a safe space on your college campus, and you need Black dormitories, and you reinvent segregation really in order to protect you from your anxieties, from the inner sense that you really may be inferior, may be unable. You look around, you see white students who are taking charge, who are succeeding, living a certain kind of life that's alien, it's not a part of your background. Well then, I don't like white people. I don't trust white people. I never will trust white people. I feel a lot better now. I feel anxiety taken away, sliding away. So I'm looking now that the Black movement in America is becoming more global. We look for opportunities for particularly white victimizers. This, it seems to me, is the fate of the Jewish community in America today. In its negative representation, that it plays this role for minorities, particularly, of even these people who have suffered themselves are racist and systemically racist and white supremacist and so forth and so on. So I think that's what the Jewish-Palestinian situation is really all about. And of course, the tragedy is that the minute people take on a victim-focused identity, they become impotent in their own lives. Because victims don't act in the world. They protest the world, but they don't make and build things themselves. And so they end up confirming that. The answer is so simple for me, at any rate. You study hard in school. You read to your children when they are born so that they pick up the language and all of its nuances and so forth at an early age. They learn the alphabet, they learn their numbers, they play games, you read stories to them, you develop their brain. You do that from the moment they're born. You take marriage seriously. You don't say, well, it's okay, I'm 18 years old and I've got 3 kids by 3 different fathers. And there's nothing wrong with that. And they would then begin to do the same behavior. And you just begin to multiply in that sense. the answers are simple, but if whites say that, and this is another element of the problem, and that is white guilt and deference. Whites swoop in, they're shamed, they've been historically benefited from white supremacy. And so now they want to prove that they're innocent of it. And so they say to Black people, look, we'll take over your problems, your underdevelopment, and we'll fix you. We'll give you the programs, we'll give you this and that. And so they take away our agency over our own fate. They claim to want to help us, and they mire us more and more in helplessness and immaturity and weakness and self-doubt. Palestinians come to America and see how they, in relation to Jews, in relation to Israel, they spend all their time casting themselves as victims and people who are entitled. And so they run into the same problem Blacks run into. They get goodies, they get all sorts of foreign aid, they're supported in this hustle. And they become dangerous. They are the bane of the Jewish of Israel. But it's a pattern that's replicable across groups, ethnic groups, and so as long as there's that paradigm of the victim and the victimizer, there's going to be this class of grievance hustlers who make a living off of that tension. A good section of middle class Black America, I don't know the exact numbers, but a good section of Black middle class America believes in that hustle and lives off of that hustle. We're not coming into the mainstream in real jobs and real careers. We're coming in as HR people, as human resources people who are there to attend to the emotional stresses of college life for minorities. That's not real progress. That's going to go nowhere. Soon whites will get tired of that, drop it, and there you'll be. We have to, the hard lesson we have, and the group that I'm so proud to feel a certain connection to, is when Jews ran into, who have been persecuted forever, came out of the Holocaust, they finally said, never again. They meant it. They took charge of their fate. They said, we will never put our fate in the hands of somebody else who's giving us some sort of spinning some tale. We have to prove our own value, our own worth, first of all to ourselves, but then to the larger world as well. That's our challenge. That's what everybody's afraid of. And until we do that, we're going to have hatred.
In the Durban Declaration and the Program of Action of the international community declared its full commitment to address racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other related intolerances at the national, regional, and international level.
The G77 and China views the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action as a valuable opportunity to enhance public understanding about its comprehensive nature and as a timely reminder to all that racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance are scourges that must be eliminated.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, in addition to being a nuclear cardiologist. He is a former lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy who served 11 years as a medical officer, including a tour as a staff internist to the U.S. Congress and U.S. Supreme Court. He was appointed to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where he served for 4 years. He routinely briefs members of Congress and appears frequently on national and international media as an expert on Islamist extremism, national security, and foreign policy. Thank you so much for being with us today, Zuhdi.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for that introduction and your trust and friendship and all your work to preserve human rights for all. And thank you for including me in this august assembly of respected speakers in this crucial conference. Frankly, it's sad, if not embarrassing, especially to me as a Muslim, that we have to discuss and deny the obvious, that the liberal democracy of Israel, the preeminent ally of the United States and the West, is not an apartheid state, and it is the convenient propaganda, or agitprop, if you will, target of radicals across the planet. Which radicals? The radical Islamists, along with their red socialist communist partners across the world. And I want to first touch on what this red-green axis is. They're deep allies, dedicated far leftists and illiberal Islamists who remain, that relationship remains baffling and enigmatic. They're forces that have pushed the Durban lie for now over 20 years. So why do the 21st century progressivists, supposedly consumed with human rights and social justice, find common cause with a religiously doctrinaire subset of Muslims who, far from practicing social justice and adhering to human rights, ultimately seek to live in a society governed by Sharia or Islamic jurisprudence? It's basically the far left's bigotry of low expectations, where they reveal that identity politics, fabricated victimization, is the only card they care about, not the truth card, not the card of actual human rights, that tribal communities dominated by the Islamist and the Arab establishment, either from abroad or theocratic Islamists here at home in America, the left's Palestinian darlings, whose violent actions they excuse, they infantilize them as victims of Western influence and the Israeli state, and are often taught in our mosques that state-sponsored terrorism or militarism, if you will, is the West's fault, is Israel's fault. But in fact, they teach grotesque anti-Semitic tropes such as the protocols. Mein Kampf is translated into Arabic, and many of the radical Islamists teach a version of Islam that radicalizes our communities and has anti-Semitic interpretations of various passages in the Quran. You see that most highlighted in the translation in Hamas's charter itself of hadith that calls for the genocide against Jews in their own charter. That's not by accident. That's what political Islam is. It's a supremacist doctrine. And Durban sort of brings together these allies in which they find a common enemy. They create agitation propaganda. And Israel is one of the primary targets of that propaganda. But also it serves their purpose of demonizing Western democracies, Western freedom, free speech, and all the principles that we stand for. So whether it's historical examples of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the spiritual leader of the Palestinians that worked with the Nazis, all the way to Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, who's adored by the Black Lives Matter, some of the leaders in the Black Lives Matter movements, and has had a history of horrific tropes against the Jewish people, and leads through anti-Semitism in their ideology. But oddly enough, that same spirit of hypocrisy, where the progressivists who claim to care about social justice actually work as leading hate mongers of hate against Jews, The global community of Islamists have made fighting so-called Islamophobia their cause célèbre. They've seen raised this issue in the Durban conferences now in its 4th iteration. And yet they're all too often frequently quiet when it comes to talking about communist China's genocide against Uyghur Muslims and the 14 million Muslims there, or the hundreds and thousands of Muslims massacred by the Assad regime, or tortured by the Iranian Islamist regime, or imprisoned by the Islamists of Erdogan's AKP and the Islamist destruction of Turkey's freedom and democratic institution, or spread with the lies of Al Jazeera with Qatar's Islamism, or the Taliban's Islamism, as we've seen unroofed now with America's hasty departure from Afghanistan. Reactionary Islamists and so-called progressivists enjoy a purely utilitarian transactional relationship. They use each other to foment social unrest and hate under the virtue signaling guise of countering transphobia, Islamophobia, or other so-called social injustices. In short, they're perfectly happy to form tactical alliances along the way, and common enemies they inflate in order to further their strategic goal of ending capitalism, free speech, and individual rights. My family escaped this well-known synergy in Syria and across the Middle East, where Arabist parties like the Baathists of the Assads and Saddam Hussein worked seamlessly with Islamists like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, ISIS, and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Taliban. Their alliances over generations have been tumultuous, fraught with spasms of conflict when they finally got to vying for power. But the synergy is repeated from nation to nation, and there's no country that epitomizes the pathology of that synergy that they've created than Israel's fight to speak the truth, to fight against their propaganda. And we see this in the UN, where Venezuela and China work with the Khomeinis of Iran, work with Qatar, work with Assad to demonize Israel, to obsess in their agenda against Israel. And Durban is, under the guise of racism, is actually all about fomenting hate against the West and against Israel. It's a farce. By obsessing and fabricating misinformation on Israel, the green Islamist theocratic movements and their red socialist dictators are ready to accept the fact that we in the West somehow should be self-loathing and accept the contrived notions of Islamophobia, racism, and so-called apartheid. The UN is a farce. My family in Aleppo, Damascus, and other towns in Syria can tell you that the Convention Against Chemical Weapons and the genocide in Syria has been an insult that the UN actually claims that they cared about that. Nothing's been done by the UN. Now, I want to briefly step aside and tell you what is this political Islam or Islamism, because so many people have asked me, why do I care so much about anti-Semitism? Why do I care about Israel, aside from being somebody who likes to make sure people know what the truth is versus the lies that are spread? The reality is our work against political Islam for reform is epitomized by fighting anti-Semitism. Why? Well, political Islam is theocratic Islam, the belief that the state identity is not a secular one for all under government, but under the constitution, but rather only for Muslims through an Islamic jurisprudence where the Quran is a constitution and not just a personal religious book, where the Sharia is not just legalisms for Muslims that want to practice in an orthodox way, but rather a legal precedent for the entire country. So therefore, the state identity is Islamist. So you see this in movements across the planet, from things that claim to be secular, like Pakistan, Islamic Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to Hamas's movement itself, which is an Islamic movement that ultimately seeks to place Sharia over the rule of Muslims and non-Muslims alike. They demonize the other. They divide the world into the land of Islam and the land of war. Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb in Arabic, as they would say. So therefore, nothing epitomized that division of the world than creating fabrications and demonizations of Jews in the state of Israel. And thus they take a relationship that my grandfather told me was close and equal, like the relationship of the Abrahamic faiths and the relationship of Judaism and Islam. My grandfather was a businessman in Aleppo and a democracy activist after the French pulled out in 1948. used to tell me how closely he worked with the Jewish business community in Aleppo. And now there is no Jewish community left in Syria. And by the way, that was far before ISIS even existed. There was no Jewish community left in Syria. So the bottom line is there are two forces seeking to destroy the state of Israel and create fabrications about the realities of the truth of the beauty of the democracy that is Israel. And that's political Islam and its movements, its grassroots movements, and then secular dictatorships that we see in the OIC and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Left to their own devices, many of these countries would be at war with one another, like Iran and Saudi Arabia, but yet finding a common enemy and creating fictitious conspiracy narratives like they do against Israel through Durban and otherwise, then they unite and create boogeymen like Islamophobia to prevent free speech against Islamic theocracy. And thus it brings me full circle to why Muslims should care about ending anti-Semitism, not only for humanitarian reasons and what has happened to the Jewish people over time as their populations have been wiped out because of the grotesque anti-Semitism, but because if we're going to fix our own house, we need to understand that anti-Semitism is a symptom. I'm a doctor in my daytime job, and we don't treat symptoms only. We primarily treat disease. We treat cancer. On the front page of our website at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy is a quote from the Quran that says, "Believers, conduct yourselves with justice and bear witness before God, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, or your kin." This is the reality. If we're going to fight racism, we need to fight it at home. Arab racism that exists against non-Arabs, Islamist racism and hate and bigotry against all those who practice any other faith. And the Jewish community is the primary target of that. I so wish my grandfather and father were alive to see what's happening in Syria over the last 10 years since the Arab awakening. And as painful and horrific as it is to see the loss of life, many can tell you it's the first time they've been awake to realize the reality of what's happening in Syria. Yes, the revolution's failed many times and it'll continue to fail, especially as external influences like Russia and Iran continue to drive the protection of the Assads. But the most important message to all of you is that for the first time in the last 10 years, they're not talking about Israel and Syria. They're not talking about boogeymen that they create, that Assad's media has attempted to create. There is a united belief that the primary, secondary, and tertiary problems in Syria are all Assad, ISIS, radical Islam, and our own medieval interpretations of our faith and fascist Arabist movements like the Ba'athist movement. But sadly, the interesting thing is there's been no Arab awakening in the Palestinian areas. Hamas has continued to horrifically control the legal system within Palestinian areas and disseminate false information through mosques, etc., and radicalize its community. And I can tell you that the lies of Durban will continue as long as two things continue. One is political Islam spreads and dominates, and Muslims don't push back against the Hamases of the world, and especially in the Palestinian areas, until they have a Arab awakening against their own Islamist movements, you won't see a change there. And second, as long as so many of the far left movements in the world continue to give them oxygen and deny their own hypocrisy, you will continue to see this. And I, as long as I'm breathing, will continue to fight for the freedom of Muslims to criticize Islamists, the fight against hate and racism pushed by Islamists and Arabists alike. And the link between defeating anti-Semitism and defeating Islamism could not be stronger or more obvious to me. And I hope all of you realize that that link is there. And that anyone who cares about defeating theocrats within my faith, just as the West, America was created on the foundations of defeating theocrats, must also care about fighting against the lie that is anti-Semitism, the lie that is Durban, and any hatred of Jews or Israel. I want to end with one thing. I visited Israel 3 times. And I apologize for having to say this, but I was struck by how normal Israel is. I was always told through media of the Islamists how oppressive and dictatorship Israel was. And the reality was it was no different than America. We visited many of the towns, and talked to the judges and others. I talked to Muslims who told me how they could practice their faith through their Sharia court system there more free than they could anywhere else. That's not an apartheid state. And the reality is it's agitprop for those who do say that it is an apartheid state, when in fact it's purely anti-Semitism that's being spread. So thank you.
The International Conference on Combating Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, held in Durban in 2001, is deemed to be a turning point in the field of human rights in today's world. Adoption of the DDPA remains as the permanent achievement of the active participation of states in their struggle against all classic and new forms and manifestations of racism and racial discrimination.
The United Nations, which began its life as an anti-Nazi alliance, should 30 years later find itself on its way to becoming the world center of anti-Semitism. Hitler would have felt at home on a number of occasions during the past year listening to the proceedings in this forum. The re-establishment of Jewish independence in Israel, after centuries of struggle to overcome foreign conquest and exile, is a vindication of the fundamental concepts of the equality of nations and of self-determination. To question the Jewish people's right to national existence and freedom is not only to deny to the Jewish people the right accorded to every other people on this globe, but is also to deny the central precepts of the United Nations. For Zionism is nothing more and nothing less than the Jewish people's sense of origin and destination in the land linked eternally with his name. It is also the instrument whereby the Jewish nation seeks an authentic fulfillment of itself. On this issue, the world, as represented in this hall, has divided itself into good and bad, decent and evil, human and debased. The vote of each delegation will record in history its country's stand on anti-Semitic racism and anti-Judaism. You yourselves bear the responsibility for your stand before history, for as such will you be viewed in history. But we, the Jewish people, will not forget. For us, the Jewish people, this is but a passing episode in a rich and event-filled history. We put our trust in our providence, in our faith and beliefs, in our time-hallowed tradition, in our striving for social advance and human values, and in our people wherever they may be. For us, the Jewish people, this resolution based on hatred, falsehood, and arrogance is devoid of any moral or legal value. For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Last, but definitely not least, it is not too late to turn your attention to the countries that have yet to pull out of the Durban 4 conference. Among them, many democratic states in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Rise up. Let them hear your voices. Information and updates on the position of individual countries can be found on the website of Human Rights Voices at humanrightsvoices.org. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to CAMRA and its indefatigable director, Andrea Levin, for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you to Sarah Willig at Human Rights Voices for her invaluable help in putting this together. Thank you to Dr. Alan Kadish and his leadership at Touro College and University System. And a heartfelt thank you once again to all of today's speakers who stepped up and into a virtual setting when circumstances meant we could no longer meet in person. The whole of this conference will be made available online permanently, and we hope that you will share it with your own networks. Together, we can make a difference.